Your dad's a hero. Huh? Sure, kid. And I'm the president. The officer laughed. The clerks chuckled, and a boy with an old battered cap just gripped his father's dog tag tighter, without saying a word. He didn't argue. He didn't cry. He just sat there small silent, carrying a legacy too heavy for most grown men to bear. And when the heavy doors swung open, when a decorated colonel walked in and saluted him, first, the whole town learned something they should have known all along. Real honor doesn't shout. It stands quietly. If you believe some names are too sacred to doubt, stay with us. This story will change the way you see respect forever. Welcome to Grateful Stories, where tales of compassion and kindness are told. Let's uncover what really happened. The morning sun painted the small town of Brooksville in soft gold as Margaret Hale pushed open the heavy door of her bakery. The scent of fresh bread and cinnamon rolls wafted into the street, mixing with the crisp autumn air. It was her favorite time of year, the season of harvest of gratitude and quiet reflections. Margaret adjusted her apron and checked the list pinned near the register. Today's delivery, 2 dozen apple turnovers to City Hall for their Friday staff meeting. A simple task, or so she thought. She packed the boxes carefully, tying each one with a twine bow the way she always did. Old-fashioned, some said. Margaret just smiled when they did. Some things were better the old way, like respect, like kindness, like remembering who came before. She lifted the boxes into the back seat of her old Ford and headed downtown. The streets were already busy. Mothers wrangling toddlers, retirees chatting over coffee, workers rushing in and out of the post office. Brooksville was a small town, but it bustled with life in its own unhurried way. As she pulled up to City Hall, Margaret spotted them immediately. A young woman no more than 30 with tired eyes and a second-hand coat, standing awkwardly near the front steps. And next to her, a little boy. He couldn't have been more than 9 years old. Small for his age, maybe, but there was a seriousness about him that made Margaret pause. The boy wore jeans patched at the knees, scuffed sneakers, and a battered, oversized army cap perched stubbornly on his head. He clutched the brim with one hand as the wind tugged at it, like it was something precious. Margaret watched as the woman, his mother, surely took a few steps toward the entrance, her purse clutched tightly. The boy hesitated, glancing up at the big stone building with a wary kind of respect before following. Margaret lingered a moment longer than she meant to, something tugging at her heart. Then she grabbed the pastry boxes and followed them inside. City Hall was louder than usual. Phones rang, clerks bustled back and forth. The scent of old paper and floor wax filled the air. Margaret set her boxes on the staff lounge table, exchanged a few pleasantries, then wandered toward the front lobby, drawn by the sight of the boy again. He and his mother stood at the counter, waiting their turn. The receptionist barely glanced up. "Take a seat. Someone will call you." Margaret noticed how the mother's shoulders stiffened. She led the boy to a hard plastic bench against the wall. They sat close together like two birds bracing against a storm. The boy tugged the cap lower over his eyes and pulled something from his jacket, a worn dog tag strung on a fraying cord. He ran his fingers over it over and over, as if the grooves of the letters were sacred paths he had to walk. Margaret's heart clenched. She knew that gesture. She'd seen it in war widows before, clinging to the last tangible pieces of someone lost too soon. She was about to turn away when Officer Blake entered the lobby. Blake was one of those men who filled a room without meaning to, or maybe he did. Big, broad, loud, he wore his badge like a trophy, not a duty. Margaret had never warmed to him. He spotted the boy almost immediately, and true to form, couldn't resist. "Well, look at this little soldier," Blake boomed, striding over. The boy stiffened but said nothing. "What's that you've got there, kid?" Blake pointed at the dog tag, smirking. The boy looked up, his face calm but proud. "It's my dad's," he said simply. He was a soldier, a real hero. The words hung in the air, earnest, unashamed. Blake barked a laugh. "A hero? Huh, sure he was. Bet he rode tanks and fought dragons too." A few clerks chuckled under their breath. The boy's knuckles whitened around the dog tag, but he didn't flinch. He just looked back down, his thumb tracing the letters again. Margaret felt something twist inside her. It wasn't just cruelty. It was ignorance, and worse, a refusal to even imagine that a quiet boy with a battered cap could be telling the truth. She wanted to speak up, to say something, but her throat closed. She was just the baker who would listen. Instead, she stayed where she was, silent, witness to the injustice unfolding. The mother, Helen, Margaret Guest, placed a protective hand on her son's shoulder, her jaw tight. She didn't argue. She didn't explain. She simply leaned down and whispered something in the boy's ear. Whatever she said, it made him sit up straighter. The old cap slipped slightly to one side, but he didn't adjust it. He just kept his hand firm on that dog tag like it was an anchor in rough seas. Margaret saw it clearly. Then something many in the room missed. The boy wasn't playing pretend. He wasn't telling tall tales. He was carrying something too heavy for his small hands, a legacy. As Margaret watched, the boy's gaze flickered upward, not at Blake, not at the clerks, laughing, but beyond them, at a framed American flag on the wall. And in that moment, Margaret understood. This wasn't just a child missing a father. This was a boy trying in his own quiet way to honor a man the world had already started to forget. And God help them all if they let that happen. The clock on the lobby wall ticked loudly in the silence that followed Blake's mockery. Margaret Hale stood near the vending machine, pretending to browse the snacks, but her eyes never left the boy. Evan Taylor sat stiffly beside his mother, one hand clenched around the dog tag, the other resting in his lap. His old army cap, a little too large, slipped forward, slightly shadowing his face. He didn't adjust it. He simply stared at the floor as if willing himself invisible. No one said anything. The clerks had turned back to their keyboards. The receptionist tapped her pen impatiently. Only Margaret, unnoticed in her corner, truly watched. She noticed how Helen Taylor kept her hand firmly on her son's back, a silent reassurance. She saw how the boy's small chest rose and fell in controlled, deliberate breaths like a soldier standing at attention under fire. Margaret's heart ached. She wanted to cross the room, kneel in front of him, and whisper that he wasn't alone. That somewhere in this town, someone still remembered what real sacrifice meant. But her legs stayed frozen, and then someone else moved. The janitor, an old man with a slight limp gray hair thinning at the crown, pushing a mop across the scuffed tile floors. No one paid him any mind. He was invisible the way older men sometimes became in a town that prized shiny things over quiet service. But Margaret saw him. She saw the way he paused, leaning heavily on the mop handle, how his gaze sharpened when he heard the boy's name. Taylor, the janitor, straightened, setting the mop carefully against the wall. He fumbled in his pocket for something. A battered old flip phone. Margaret's heart skipped. There was a purpose to his movements. He stepped outside, slipping quietly through the lobby doors. No one noticed. No one but Margaret. She watched the door swing shut behind him, a faint breath of cold air following, and something deep inside her stirred. Hope, small, fragile, but real. Inside, Officer Blake sauntered back toward the front desk, laughing with another officer about kids these days and their fantasy hero dads. Margaret clenched her fists inside her apron. Her stomach twisted in a slow, helpless knot. She couldn't erase the boy's hunched shoulders from her mind, the way he clutched that tag like it was his anchor, his armor and his shield, and all rolled into one. Minutes dragged on. The clock ticked. Helen Taylor finished filling out some paperwork, her handwriting shaking slightly. The receptionist called another name. Someone else rose, walked past them. Life moved forward, indifferent. Margaret looked at Evan again. The boy wasn't crying. He wasn't pleading. He simply waited, quiet, composed, carrying a weight too heavy for his small frame. And somewhere outside those walls, an old man with a limp was dialing a number from memory. The phone rang. Once, twice picked up, Margaret couldn't hear the conversation, but she could imagine it. A gravelly voice explaining urgently about a boy, a name, a disrespect witnessed, and on the other end of the line, someone listening, someone remembering. 10 more minutes passed. Margaret shifted on her feet, wondering if she dared step forward, maybe offer Helen a cup of coffee from the lounge, maybe slip a cinnamon roll into Evan's hand. Before she could make up her mind, a sound shattered the room. Not loud, just sharp enough to cut through the apathy. The heavy oak doors of City Hall swung open with a gust of cold air. Boots on tile, measured, deliberate. Everyone turned. Margaret caught her breath. A man stood in the doorway, framed by sunlight. Not just any man. A soldier, full dress, uniform, medals gleaming against the deep blue of his coat, silver eagles on each shoulder. Colonel's insignia. He didn't stride in like Blake didn't bark commands or demand attention. He walked with a quiet authority that filled the space without noise. Margaret watched her heart pounding. The colonel's gaze swept the lobby, passing over Blake, over the clerks, over the watching citizens, until it landed on Evan. And held, without hesitation, the colonel moved forward, boots clicking crisply on the floor, straight toward the boy. Every breath in the room seemed to catch. At once, Evan looked up, wide, uncertain. The colonel stopped precisely 3 feet from him. Margaret saw it, the tiny tremble in Evan's small fingers tightening around the dog tag. For a long, heavy moment, no one moved. Then in a single fluid motion, the colonel raised his hand to his forehead and rendered the boy a perfect, formal military salute. The room froze, even the fluorescent lights seemed to buzz quieter. Margaret pressed a hand to her mouth, feeling tears sting her eyes. Evan stared up at the man, unsure. Slowly, hesitantly, he stood, his battered cap tilting precariously as he rose. Margaret noticed the way the colonel's eyes softened at the sight. There was no mockery here, no pity, only respect. Deep, unshakable respect. "The colonel spoke, young man," he said, voice steady but full of something deeper. Something like reverence. "I knew your father. Sergeant First Class, Daniel Taylor. He wasn't just a hero. He was the reason a lot of us made it home." Silence absolute. You could hear the flutter of a paper falling somewhere in the back. Evan's mouth moved, but no sound came out. His mother, Helen, covered her mouth, tears spilling down her cheeks. Officer Blake shifted awkwardly, color draining from his face. Margaret saw it all and saw how at the center of it stood a boy in a worn cap holding a simple dog tag and being seen for who he truly was. A son, a legacy, a quiet kind of hero. For a long, breathless moment, no one in the lobby moved. The colonel's hand dropped from his salute slowly, almost ceremoniously. He straightened his polished boots, clicking softly as he shifted his stance. Margaret stood frozen, heart pounding painfully against her ribs. This moment, so simple, so silent, felt heavier than any speech she had ever heard. Evan, small and brave, stared up at the man towering over him. The boy's face, still half shielded by the old cap, held an expression Margaret couldn't name. Something between awe and desperate hope. The colonel's voice broke the silence, low but commanding. "Your father," he said, each word weighed carefully, "was not just a soldier. He was a standard A compass for men like me." When the world turned dark, Margaret felt a ripple pass through the room. The clerks, the officers even. Officer Blake, every single person now stood utterly still. No more snickering, no more whispers, only listening. The colonel crouched slightly, bringing himself closer to Evan's height. Without losing an ounce of dignity, he reached into his jacket and withdrew a small, folded photograph. With deliberate reverence, he unfolded it and placed it gently into Evan's trembling hands. The photo was old edges, worn colors faded by time. It showed a group of young soldiers in full gear standing proud and exhausted in some dusty, far-off place. At the very center, standing a little apart, was a man whose smile was small but steady, whose eyes seemed to see far beyond the moment. And Margaret didn't need anyone to tell her. It was Evan's father, Sergeant First Class Daniel Taylor. "You see him," the colonel said softly. "Sala." Evan nodded, unable to speak. "That man carried 50 pounds of gear, a radio and 2 wounded soldiers out of an ambush in Helmand province. He took a hit to the shoulder but refused evacuation until every last one of us was safe." The colonel's voice caught slightly, but he forced it steady. "He taught us how to lead when fear clawed at your throat, how to stand when your knees shook, how to move forward when the world crumbled behind you." Margaret saw it, the way Evan's small hands tightened on the photo, the way Helen's tears ran unchecked down her cheeks, and for the first time since the boy had entered the building, Margaret saw something shift inside him. A tiny flickering light, pride. The colonel stood, turning slowly to face the room. His voice, though never raised, filled every corner. Sergeant First Class Daniel Taylor wasn't just a name on a roster. He was the reason half my men ever got home. He turned, slightly pinning Officer Blake with a gaze so sharp it cut through the man's bravado. "Like a blade, you laugh at his son," the colonel said, not shouting but somehow making the words boom in the air. "But you owe your ability to mock to men like him." Blake flushed deep red. He opened his mouth to speak but found no words. "Good," Margaret thought fiercely. Let him feel it. Let him finally understand. The colonel's gaze softened again as he turned back to Evan. He knelt once more, voice dropping lower, more personal. "I was just a scared lieutenant back then," he said. "And your dad, he carried me when my legs gave out." He smiled, a real smile touched with sadness. "I wear these medals because of him. Because when it mattered most, your father didn't think about his own life. He thought about all of us." Evan's lip quivered. Margaret felt her own vision blur. Around the lobby, a slow, powerful shift began to ripple. One by one, the officers and clerks stood a little straighter. One by one, heads dipped in shame or lifted in respect. Even the receptionist, the one who had barely glanced up before now, wiped her eyes with the corner of her sleeve. Officer Blake, face pale and tight, dropped his gaze to the floor. No words were needed. The truth had found its voice, and it spoke through a child, a cap, a dog tag, and a man who remembered. Finally, the colonel rose fully and extended his hand to Evan again. "Young man," he said, "you carry more honor in your little hand than most men will carry in their whole lives, Evan." Blinking back tears took the colonel's hand in his own, small shaking one. And in that handshake, in that simple human touch, a bridge was built between the past and the future, between a father's sacrifice and a son's enduring legacy. Margaret felt the tears spill down her cheeks freely now. Unashamed, this was why she baked extra bread on Veterans Day. This was why she still tied her boxes with twine, because some things, the good things, deserve to be remembered, deserve to be carried forward. Outside the wide glass doors, Margaret glimpsed the old janitor standing quietly, leaning on his mop, watching. He didn't smile. He didn't nod. He simply stood a little straighter, like the old soldier he once was. And for Margaret Hale, for everyone in that room, something important had shifted that day. Not loud, not flashy, just right. The lobby remained suspended in a hush so deep Margaret could hear the faint hum of the heating vents overhead. It was as if time itself had paused just long enough for honor to reclaim its rightful place. Margaret dabbed at her eyes with the corner of her apron, trying not to draw attention. The boy with the old cap, the soldier with medals on his chest, and the silence that now filled the hall. It was all too much, too sacred to disturb. Then a door creaked open at the far end of the building. All heads turned. Out stepped a tall man in a dark uniform, not a police officer, but someone different. His stride was measured, deliberate. There was a gravity to him that pulled the gaze of everyone in the lobby. Captain Thomas Reynolds, head of the Brooksville City Police. Margaret had met him once years ago when she baked pies for the department's Thanksgiving event. She remembered his firm handshake, his quiet dignity. Now Captain Reynolds' face was carved from stone. He carried no clipboard, no files, only his authority, and something else Margaret recognized immediately. Purpose. The captain walked straight toward the small gathering. Helen, Evan, Colonel Monroe, and a crowd of silent witnesses. He stopped in front of Evan. The boy looked up, eyes wide beneath the shadow of his battered cap. Captain Reynolds knelt down. A man of rank, a man of years, bringing himself to the boy's eye level. He extended his hand. "Matthew Taylor," he said, his voice steady but carrying an undercurrent of emotion. "I'm Captain Reynolds, and I would be honored if you would come visit our police academy next month." The lobby stirred slightly. Margaret held her breath. Captain Reynolds continued, "I want you to speak to the new recruits, to teach them what it looks like to stand tall when someone tries to knock you down." Helen gasped softly, one hand over her heart. Evan, stunned, could barely nod. The captain smiled, a small, sincere thing, and added, "Your father shaped men on the battlefield. Today you shape this room." He stood, turning to address the crowd. His voice grew stronger. "Let this be clear. In this department, we respect service, we respect sacrifice, no matter what uniform you wore or how small your shoulders may be." His eyes slid to Officer Blake, who stood rigid, face flushed with shame. "And we especially respect the children who carry that legacy forward." A murmur of agreement passed through the room. One by one, officers straightened their spines. One by one, civilians shifted from passive observers to witnesses of something bigger than themselves. Margaret wiped another tear from her cheek. The captain wasn't finished. He turned back to Helen and Evan. "I've reviewed your husband's service record," he said. He nodded respectfully toward Colonel Monroe. "And I've spoken to those who knew him." He looked Evan in the eye. "Your father's memory deserves more than a dusty file. Starting today, our precinct will dedicate a place of honor in our main hall." He paused, letting the words settle. "It will bear his name. And every officer who walks past it will remember the price of their freedom." The weight of that promise settled over the room like a warm, invisible blanket. Margaret saw Helen's shoulders shake with silent sobs. She saw Evan, too young for the enormity of the moment, clutching his father's dog tag tighter. And she saw, most of all, something blooming quietly inside the boy. A reaffirmation, a deep-rooted understanding. He wasn't just carrying his father's memory anymore. He was becoming part of it. Captain Reynolds gave a final nod, then turned to Officer Blake. His tone shifted, cool, commanding. "Officer Blake." "My office now." Blake paled visibly but obeyed without a word, trudging toward the hallway, like a man walking into a storm he had brought upon himself. The door clicked shut behind them. The colonel rested a hand lightly on Evan's shoulder. "You did good today, son," he said. Evan looked up at him, and for the first time since stepping into City Hall, the boy smiled. It was small, it was tentative, but it was real. Margaret exhaled slowly, her chest aching with the sheer beauty of what she'd witnessed. A boy mocked and doubted had stood taller than men twice his size, had reminded a town, maybe even himself, that respect wasn't something you demanded, it was something you carried. As the lobby began to stir back to life, quiet conversations, nods, handshakes, Margaret turned toward the door. She paused, watching Evan one last time. The boy still held his father's dog tag, still wore that battered old cap, sitting slightly crooked on his head. But now he wore something else too, a quiet, unshakable pride. 2 weeks later, a cold breeze swept across Brooksville as townspeople gathered outside the precinct. The sun hung low, filtering through thin clouds and pale shafts of gold. Margaret Hale clutched a tray of still warm cinnamon rolls as she made her way toward the crowd. She had baked all night, and offering in a way, not for profit, not for recognition, but because today mattered. Today they would unveil the memorial. A quiet place inside the police department, dedicated to a man whose name had once been mocked within those walls, and now would be carved into them forever. The lobby looked different now. Fresh paint covered the walls. A new plaque gleamed under the recessed lighting, mounted on the far end of the entrance hall. Above it, the American flag hung proudly. Margaret squeezed through the gathering throng of officers, townsfolk, and a few veterans in uniform. At the very front stood Helen Taylor, her face pale but composed, and next to her Evan, wearing his father's old army cap, polished shoes, and a simple white shirt tucked carefully into dark trousers. The dog tag still hung proudly from his neck. The mayor stepped up to the podium, first offering words about service, sacrifice, community. The police chief followed, speaking of lessons learned. Margaret listened, but her eyes never left Evan. The boy stood tall, small among the sea of adults, but somehow larger than them all. He clutched a folded flag presented to him earlier by Captain Reynolds himself and held it against his chest with both hands. Margaret felt her throat tighten. This boy, she thought, was carrying more than any child ever should, and yet he bore it with a grace most men could never muster. Finally, Captain Reynolds stepped up again. He didn't use notes. He didn't need them. 2 weeks ago, he began, the voice steady. A child reminded us what real courage looks like. The room fell utterly silent. Evan Taylor reminded us that honor doesn't come from the loudest voice in the room. It comes from quiet hands that hold on to memories, even when no one else believes. Margaret swallowed hard against the lump rising in her throat. She wasn't the only one. Officers stood stiffer. Civilians wiped at their eyes. Even the mayor shifted on his feet, blinking rapidly. Captain Reynolds turned toward Evan. "And so today," he said, "we dedicate this space not just to Sergeant First Class Daniel Taylor, but to every quiet hero who walks among us." He gestured toward the plaque still covered with a velvet cloth. Margaret held her breath. With a small nod from Captain Reynolds, Evan stepped forward, hands shaking slightly, but determined. He reached up and pulled the cloth away. The crowd exhaled collectively. There, gleaming under the lights, was a bronze plaque etched with careful precision. Sergeant First Class Daniel Taylor. He taught men to lead. He taught leaders to serve. Beneath the inscription hung a glass case containing his original dog tag, polished but still bearing the nicks of time. A photo, the same one Colonel Monroe had placed in Evan's hands. And beside them, a folded American flag. Simple, elegant, unforgettable. A hush lingered as people moved forward, slowly, reverently. Some saluted. Some touched the glass lightly with trembling fingers. Margaret watched Evan closely. He stood silently in front of the display, his father's cap shadowing his eyes. His small shoulders squared against the enormity of the moment. Helen came to stand beside him, one hand on his back. Colonel Monroe stood on the other side, his chest full of medals, but his eyes full of something even rarer, gratitude. Margaret drifted closer, setting her tray of cinnamon rolls on a side table no one had dared touch yet. She caught Evan glancing up at the plaque, and then in a voice just loud enough for the front row to hear, he whispered, "My dad wasn't loud. He didn't have to be." Margaret felt her knees nearly buckle. Those simple words, so small, so true, rippled through the room like a pebble dropped into still water. Captain Reynolds cleared his throat, visibly moved. He stepped beside Evan, placing a gentle hand on the boy's shoulder. "Brooksville won't forget him, son," he said quietly, "and we won't forget you either." Around the room, heads nodded. The ceremony slowly shifted into conversations. Quiet, respectful, awed. But Margaret didn't move for a long time. She stood near the back, watching the boy in the battered cap who had changed them all. Outside, the flag over the precinct flapped gently in the wind. Inside, a boy named Evan Taylor stood before a plaque that would outlast them all. A small hand holding on to memory. A legacy made visible. A silent promise that some names would never again be doubted or forgotten. The seasons changed, and with them, the rhythm of Brooksville shifted. Leaves blazed into fiery reds and golds before surrendering to the quiet hush of winter-spring unfurled in soft greens, promising renewal. And summer, lazy and golden, blanketed the town with warmth. But some things did not change. Every year on Veterans Day, Margaret Hale rose early and baked a special batch of cinnamon rolls, an old ritual she kept without fail. And every year at exactly 10 o'clock, she walked to the police precinct carrying the warm tray in both hands. Inside the lobby, the memorial still gleamed. The bronze plaque of Sergeant First Class Daniel Taylor stood silently under the American flag, the glass case beneath it meticulously polished. An empty chair was placed next to it, not for sitting, but for remembering. On the back of that chair hung a simple replica of Daniel Taylor's dog tag, freshly shined every year, engraved with a few quiet words, "For the ones who taught us how to stand." Margaret always paused before the memorial. She would set the cinnamon rolls on the side table, bow her head and whisper a small prayer of thanks, and without fail she would see him, Evan, year after year. At first he was still a small boy, awkward in his pressed shirt and polished shoes, standing stiff and serious in front of his father's name. Then he grew. The cap got smaller on his head. The dog tag lay heavier against a chest, growing broader with each passing year. Margaret watched it all, silently proudly. On his 16th birthday, Evan made a decision that surprised no one who truly knew him. He enlisted in the Army Junior ROTC program at the local high school. Margaret remembered seeing him at the fall parade that year, marching at the front of his squad. Straight-backed eyes forward, wearing his father's cap one last time before trading it for his own uniform. He wasn't the loudest, he wasn't the fastest, but he was steady, unshakable. The kind of young man you didn't notice first. But once you did, you never forgot. Helen Taylor remained his constant anchor through every practice, every award ceremony, every challenge she stood by. She stood by him, quiet, strong, proud. In Colonel Monroe, he became something like family. On weekends, you could often find the two of them at the old VFW hall. Bent over maps or history books, the older man teaching the younger, not just how to march, but how to lead. One summer, as Evan prepared to leave for Army basic training, the precinct held a small gathering. Nothing fancy, just officers and townsfolk who remembered Margaret brought extra cinnamon rolls that day, stacked high in baskets. When Evan arrived in a crisp uniform, too new to be broken in the lobby, erupted in applause. Not because he was the biggest or the boldest, but because he had become everything his father once was and everything the town hoped he would be. Captain Reynolds shook his hand with genuine respect. Colonel Monroe clapped him on the back, murmuring words Margaret couldn't hear but didn't need to. Helen hugged him fiercely, whispering through her tears. And Margaret, she stood quietly near the memorial, heart swelling. When Evan approached her, blushing a little, she smiled and pressed a small bundle into his hands. Wrapped carefully inside was his father's original dog tag, polished one last time. "This belongs with you for now," she said softly. Evan's hands trembled as he unwrapped it. He didn't say much, just nodded once firmly and slipped the dog tag around his neck under his new uniform. Where it belonged, where it always had. Later that day, as the sun sank low and the crowd thinned, Margaret remained behind. She watched Evan pause before the plaque one last time. The boy who had once clutched a battered cap and an old tag now stood tall in a uniform of his own. He saluted the plaque sharply, precisely. Then he whispered almost too softly for anyone to hear, "I'll make you proud, Dad, I promise." And Margaret knew. He already had. The door closed behind him as he walked into the wider world. A quiet march forward. Not seeking glory, not demanding recognition, just carrying a legacy. One step, one breath, one silent salute at a time. In our darkest moments, kindness still finds a way, often in the quietest places. Not everyone who helps wants recognition. Some just need to know that today, someone isn't going hungry. And sometimes, that alone is enough to change a life. You may forget the story, but if no one retells it, history stays silent forever. Subscribe to Grateful Stories, where justice is honored, kindness is remembered, and no act of quiet heroism is ever lost.